The vexed sort of question of reform and revolution is something that I have to think about a lot as somebody whose background is an environmental activist. And it's something that, keeps me up at night. And often, and I'm sure there's comrades here who've been on the left a while, discussions about reform or revolution can often bring more heat than light. And I think I'm pleased to have such a great first speech to clear things up. But I think it's one that is posed quite severely by the problem of ecological breakdown, right? As well as just the scale of violence in the world system at the moment. Whether it's the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people, the mass death of the disabled and poor that was facilitated over the last few years, the day-to-day attacks on trans people in Britain, all sort of create a sense and a feeling of escalating crisis, of escalating disaster, I think, for all of us here in Britain. For Walter Benjamin, one of the most florid and tragic of Marxist thinkers, in his Arcades project, this sort of massive, unfinished, fragmentary work, he has a throwaway sort of paragraph on the idea of catastrophe and progress, as he states, the concept of progress must be grounded in the idea of catastrophe, that things are status quo is the catastrophe. I know many revolutionary who would feel quite closely to that feeling. But similarly, Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, in reference to the Palestinian catastrophe, the Nakba of 1948, the mass murder and expulsion of the Palestinian people, said the Nakba is not a memory, it is a continuous uprooting. So there's an affinity here between the Marxism of Benjamin and the Palestinian thought of Darwish. This idea that capitalism relies on a continuing disaster. And this is something that the Marxist Feminist Collective out of the woods, as well as the Salvage Group, talk about when they talk about conditions of ordinary disaster, the day-to-day drudgery of capitalism, which is then punctuated by the extraordinary disasters, wars, pandemics, ecological disasters like flooding. As revolutionaries, by understanding that these forms of ongoing catastrophe and disaster are a feature, not a bug of capitalism, is merely the first step in what is a pitched battle that we must spend our lives engaged in. And this ongoing and escalating catastrophe, particularly in terms of the environment, causes quite a polarizing response if we just pose reform or revolution. For some, there's a push to immediately leaping to demand the end of the system, right? Why don't we just immediately have the general strike, the insurrection, occupy everything? As if these issues are merely a matter of effort, of not having enough people just doing enough to do the revolution. On the other end, there are those who see escalating ecological breakdown and they demand practicality, right? The early revisionists of the 1890s are a classic in this regard. This idea that we must align with the forces of reform to secure something to manage with the horrors that we face every day. So how do we avoid this trap? What I say a lot to other environmental activists, having come out of sort of youth climate spaces and got very old now, is we need to think about the next few decades, and we should talk in decades about revolutionary struggle. And doing so, we can break out of these limiting approaches. The truth is that the coming decades will see escalating increases in disasters like heat waves, diseases and droughts. We are seeing escalating militarism. We're seeing the breakdown of things like supply chains and escalating inability for just people to live in the same areas that they want to live. But we need to recognize a lesson learned during both the coronavirus pandemic and the ongoing genocide, which is capitalism's capacity to internalize and weather mass systemic violence. Which is to say that disasters, these extraordinary moments, don't simply lead to total social collapse, nor do they naturally produce revolutionary movements in response. If we're going to end capitalism, we'll have to, like Lenin says, bring this consciousness from without. We have to actually politicize people. We have to get organized and we have to leverage them against capitalism. There must be intervention agitationally and organizationally from revolutionary under very bad conditions, and this will include demands for reforms. This informs the ideas of, disaster communism, which is, I guess, my interest, which has been mobilized by thinkers as broad as Andreas Malm, the Out of the Woods Collective, and the Salvage Collective. Thinking of what building a revolutionary society in the ashes might look like. This means revolutionaries should be engaged in good sectional and what I might term defensive work, which might often seem quite reformist, as was just argued, struggles around housing, workplaces, and the cost of living. There's a difference between a Britain in 2050 dealing with all the ecological disasters that has strong workplace organising and that doesn't. We've got to recognise that, right? Work that defends people from oppressions, that gets us access to healthcare, that builds mass bases for further activity. But I think the key to breaking out of the sort of revolution reform trap is to think through revolutionary crises as against particular states in the capitalist world system. And here Daniel Ben Said, who is a key figure of the French Marxist 1968 generation, wrote a wonderful essay in and amongst the street writing of that year, where he says in his decidedly sort of French, Althusarian, Frenchian style, the state is the nodal point which maintains the conflictual equilibrium of the various modes of production combined within a social formation. It is the cohesive factor of this complex overlapping of various modes of production, between which it neutralizes any true relations of force. Which is a very long and complicated way of saying you've got to think about what state you're fighting, your big enemy at home, right? And what it means to the fact that that is actually the level that a lot of people understand politics on. So here revolutionaries need to think about how over the next few decades we will take on the British state as the leading producer of ecological destruction globally and historically, as a leading pusher of militarism, and most recently as this leading supporter of the genocide in Palestine. And it's often something that, British Marxists are quite weak on, right? Talking about the state and talking about how we're going to orient towards it, other than saying, real power is in the streets. This street movement will somehow defeat the state. This is kind of a sub-Luxemburgism, not even the complexity of Luxembourg, where people sort of expect revolution to literally just look like a series of collected strikes or a series of collected street protests that then somehow pushes through to the final crisis. This, withdraws the state from the picture and how you articulate at it. So a good example of this is to talk about what abolitionist thinkers like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and others have taken up in mobilizing Andre Gore's idea of a non-reformist reform about the state. Now, of course, this sort of terminology, this idea of a non-reformist reform, I actually think is quite bunk. I don't take it seriously. Really, it's actually picking up a Marxist idea that was kind of forgotten or really neglected in the 20th century, which is the kinds of demand we make that qualitatively shift the terrain for the organization of the workers and oppressed vis-a-vis the state. So for these Marxists and abolitionists, they talk about building resistance, of course, on the street, but they also talk about fighting for the repeal of recent policing and border powers, as well as the long-term defunding and abolition of these institutions. This is because practically every weakening of the repressive arm of the state creates more space for workers, the oppressed, and socialists to organize and merge into a revolutionary movement. This is a point, Marx and Lenin understood in the various programs if you go through and sort of view their work, but we've very much, I think, forgotten over the 20th century. Take the 1880 program of the French Workers' Party, partially drafted by Marx. What are the first few demands? Abolition of all laws over the press, meetings and association, and above all, the law against the International Working Men's Association. Removal of the budget of the religious orders and returning of the nations of the goods said to be multi-main, movable and immovable. Suppression of the public debt, abolition of the standing armies and the general arming of the people, the commune to be the master of its administration and its police. Alongside this, in the economic demands, you have rights to assembly, rights to free time, these kinds of freedom-like demands. These are the demands that expose the class domination of the state and allow the greater cohering of forces if we win them through a street movement and through, the organization of Marxist forces into something like the party. So thinking through this in the way we put demands, this is the kind of thing that Gramsci, famously engaged with when he's talking about wars of position and maneuver, rather than these are reformist, these are revolutionary, talking about terrain. So today we need to build fights, I think, about the anti-democratic nature of the British state more broadly, not just at the times when it arrests our comrades. Demands like a shorter working week, universal suffrage, a positive right to strike, and so on are important in a programmatic sense. Of course, capitalism, as with any right, will attempt to subvert it, undermine it, not give it its full content. But these kinds of mass democratic demand were once understood as part of the Marxist class struggle because they qualitatively shift the terrain which we organised on, and even a partial granting of them, even an ineffectual granting of them, was serious and allowed the further cohering of forces. These are the ideas of revolution as not just sort of a change in government, right? You can go the other way with this kind of thinking and end up like a Bernstein-esque character where you basically start to believe that the demands of changing the terrain ultimately does just mean changing the government for a workers' government. But as revolutionaries, as we keep in mind that ongoing catastrophe, we're talking about real change in the institutions of society, control and organization in the means of production. It's Marx's real movement that abolishes the present state of things. I think we're very lucky on the British left to have had comrades that have thought really deeply about these kinds of questions. I sadly never got to meet him before he passed, but Neil Davison's work on how revolutionary were the bourgeois revolutions, this giant tome, is probably one of the most important works in this regard. Really looking through, well, what were the balance of class forces? How did these institutions change? What did it mean for the ways that we could organize, and what are the results of this? More recently, Jamie Allison's work, The Age of Counter-Revolution, which looks at the Arab Springs. Similar, what are the dynamics of terrain? What are the ways in which revolution and counter-revolution interact? Because then you begin to go from the binaristic understanding of reform or revolution to begin to actually recognize questions of forces, terrain, enemies, and the urgency of the revolutionary transition, understood, I guess, in the classic Marxist phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, all this kind of big analysis, this big cohering of forces, this thinking through all these kinds of questions, as said, these are things we're going to be doing over decades under conditions of escalating ecological disaster, right? Which is not ideal. That certainly is the problem, and it's the 100% the difficulty that we're going to face, and that we're just going to have to continue to stay with as revolutionaries. But as Marx said, we operate under conditions not of our making. That is sadly, what we've got. A different source for me, who's not necessarily a Marxist, but I think is worth people engaging with, is Amilcar Cabral, the revolutionary leader of the people of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, who led the struggle against Portuguese colonialism in the 20th century. When asked, how do you deal with these big questions? How do you sustain yourself against Salazar's violent, brutal dictatorship? He said the phrase, well, unlike the Cubans who could hide in the mountains, Guinea-Bissau is a flat country. So all we have is the people. The people are our mountains. Which is to say we must be guided by a belief the capacity of the oppressed and exploited people to struggle and use this to build for the coming storms. I think in the struggle today against the genocide, we've been in one of those world historic moments similar to Lenin in the immediate situation in 1905, where there's this huge movement where the mass of people are well beyond the actual scale of the left's ability to engage with them. And there's a massive gap between their understanding of real freedom, liberation, and the demands they're making, and the false representatives in the state. So we should find hope in this, hope in the ability of people to cope with very bad situations as we continue to build our forces on the terrain in the coming very bad decades, for lack of a better way of putting it. And in these people, I have hope in the revolution, along with the many reforms along the way. So I'll finish there.